Well, let me begin by taking a word of welcome to you. We do appreciate the presence of those of you who will be in these district gatherings, who will be in whatever smaller group that decides that they want to study together this life together in the United Methodist Church offering by our laity of the Kentucky Annual Conference. And I'm grateful that we have 3 live participants here today, and so that'll help me just a little bit more to feel more comfortable in presentation because we do have some live people. And I've given them the opportunity to just indicate to me if they would like to say something or ask a question, because I would feel much more comfortable in that kind of setting. And whatever kind of way you use this video, I hope it provides an opportunity for you to be able to have dialogue. Dialogue not only with the person who may be leading your event, but dialogue with one another. If we were going throughout the day in this kind of setting, I would want us to be dividing into smaller groups and discuss certain subjects that we'll be talking about as we go along today. What you're going to be seeing, and those of you live know this because you're looking at the PowerPoint, this is the beginning slide of the title of the PowerPoint, Life Together in the United Methodist Church, offered by the Board of Discipleship. And I did use their format. Now, you will notice if you go online that you can download this PowerPoint that they have. And it is a very helpful PowerPoint. It's designed to be done in sections, and we're not doing the 5 sections that they have in the full PowerPoint. So what you're seeing now today will be an adaptation of that PowerPoint. I've gone in then and deleted a number of slides that are not appropriate for our setting, and I've added some slides that make it more appropriate for the setting that we're in. But we will be fine, I think, and I do hope that you are able to take notes for yourself. Notes not only on things that you feel you're learning, but perhaps more importantly, notes on questions that you have or thoughts that are in your mind at the moment. I would like to think, and I want to tell you that this has been my thought in my prayer life, that this presentation would be more than just a presentation to give knowledge to people who feel they want to know more about our United Methodist Church, its organization, its structure, its polity and discipline. In the sense that we all need to remember why. It's unfortunate if we come ever to a time when we forget why we're doing what we're doing. Why do we even have a local United Methodist Church? Well, we know that the discipline says that the reason, the mission of any local United Methodist Church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And why would we want to have more knowledge about the polity and discipline of this organization? Because we recognize that in reality, it is not just an organization, it's an organism. It's the body of Christ. We want to be as effective as we can be because we are a member of the body of Christ. And we have joined Christ in that commission. As he said, as the Father has sent me, so I'm sending you. So we're to be doing what Jesus did and modeled for us when he was here on the earth. Now that makes a huge difference in my thinking as to why we would be doing today what we're doing. So remember that. I hope And it would be my dream that whether you were in a finance committee meeting, you were in an administrative council meeting, whatever meeting you might be in that relates to a local or district or conference meeting of the United Methodist Church, it begins with a remembrance of the why. All right? Why we're doing what we're doing. Now, it's wonderful to bookend our meetings with prayer. I want you to feel like if you're watching the video, for example, that you could stop the video and pray right now if you haven't already prayed. There's nothing wrong with bookend prayers. But I like to think that when we're together as the people of God, the body of Christ, that we are doing worshipful work. So it's okay to pray at many different times. When we talk, for example, later about some of the struggles in our United Methodist Church, that would be a wonderful time to turn the video off and just pray together around that particular struggle or need that we're having as United Methodists. And I wish we could do that even here today if we were in just a live presentation and we're not trying to make this presentation helpful for other people at other times. Now, let me go to slide number 2, if I might, Ed, and set for you the goals that you see now on the screen of what we would hope this day would accomplish. I'm not going to try to read each of those. I want you to simply skim over those and be conscious of them and aware of some of the things that we're going to be trying to complete during this day. Now, I want to tell you that a few years back, I was invited to teach polity and discipline of the United Methodist Church at Asbury Theological Seminary. And so I did that for something like 3 years and would do it at different semesters. And the semester might be 10 or 12 weeks long. And we would try to go through pretty much of what you're going to go through in many, many less hours. All right? Now you can imagine that the class loved discussion, and often we got a bit lost from the agenda because of the discussions. But then there are a lot of good learnings that happen in those discussions, and you may use the tape in a similar kind of way. But understand that we're trying to, if you please, put in some major rocks that are important for you and I to know about our polity and discipline. And there are a lot of things that are going to unnecessarily have to fall by the wayside that are very important that you can maybe pick up in your quest for understanding better in various kind of ways. But I thought you might enjoy this just a little bit. I give this to you in sort of a lighthearted kind of way. But here is what the final exam review looked like when I would do those semester-long presentations of polity and discipline. I tried to help and coach a little bit on regard to the final, because I didn't want people to be all uptight about a final exam. The issue is not the kind of grade you make as much as the issue is what are you really learning and what's important to try not to forget. But just think about these, and these may raise some questions for you that you're going to want to ask later in regard to however this presentation is used. But I just said, for example, what section of the discipline focuses on matters of the local church? What section contains the social principles or ordained ministry, matters of church property, judicial administration? Who prepares a budget for a local church? Who has oversight over local church property matters? Who chairs committees on lay leadership? What committee is responsible for identifying and deploying leadership in the local church? What does the church council do? Now, I'll skip on down and not read every one of these, but what is an elder ordained to in our United Methodist Church? Who rules on matters of law for the church? Who enlists candidates and gives exams for potential candidates? Which is the only body empowered to enact legislation? Where are bishops elected? Who confers with the pastor and staff on effectiveness? What are conferences outside the United States called? Do we still have general rules? When did divisive disputes begin in the church? Are bishops ordained? Who is qualified to speak on behalf of the church? What is the quadrilateral? Is the United Methodist Church a legal organization? Can Board of Trustees use property without the consent of the pastor? Are the social principles law? Who can petition General Conference? What's the basic unit in the connectional system? Can requirements of the Board of Ordained Ministry exceed those of the discipline? What's the difference between a church conference and a church council? Well, I could go on, but I just wanted to give you a little sampling of what I thought in polity and discipline courses in a seminary setting people ought to have some knowledge about. Now, you may be either here, the three of you in person, or those of you who will watch the video, you might be able to answer all of those already. And you're going to say, well, I already know the answer to all of those. So if you do and you understand them well, just come up here, if one of the three of you are, and help me teach today. It'll be perfectly okay. Or if you're watching the video, you explain to the video presenter, hey, let me take over for you here. I think I can do this. I give you these little nuggets in hopes that you understand that none of us have every single answer on the tip of our tongue that someone may want to ask. In fact, when I was an active bishop serving and had district superintendents, I often said to them, do not, hear me, do not take your discipline to a church conference. Because if you do, somebody is going to want you to give a definitive answer on the spot. If you do not have your discipline, you can say, I will get back with you. Because the reality is that none of us, including bishops, have the answer to every single question that could be asked. Now, the wonderful thing is that we are a community of believers. And as a part of the body of Christ, we help one another. And the issue is that whatever we may be working on, we can have the help of brothers and sisters who can research and think with us and help us get perspective on the question. Now, let me say also that the discipline that I've been referring to a good bit here already in the beginning, introductory time, is not a club. I'm saddened by the fact that too many people have wanted to be in district meetings, even conference meetings, and certainly local church meetings who take this book and it almost comes across as a club that they're using against an opponent, as opposed to a helpful tool to help us understand better how we can be the church of God in the way that we have come to understand it through our connection. Ed, give me another slide, if you will, here as we move along. And I'm going to talk then about resources here just for a little bit. You know that the Board of Discipleship, in setting up this kind of training experience, thought it's important that we have additional resources. And indeed it is. And in fact, I've turned around here to get these two major resources that the Board of Discipleship recommends that we use in addition to the discipline. One of them, of course, is Thomas Frank's book, Polity, Practice, and Mission of the United Methodist Church. And the other is Life Together in the United Methodist Church, written by Beth Galbraith. These two books are very good books. And of course, then the latest discipline. Now, let me caution you, however, with the reality of where we are as United Methodists at this particular point. This book by Thomas Frank, this is edition, the latest edition, 2006. Now, keep in mind, this is 2021. This book is 15 years old. And I could point to you place after place after place where what Frank says and documents it in the discipline, you're not going to find. Because he was using a 2004 discipline. All right? So it doesn't make the book worthless. It just means that I want to caution you to the reality that it's dated. Now, this book, I really enjoyed what Beth Galbraith have done here. I thought she did a wonderful job in Life Together. But this book, for example, is a 2014 edition. Now, for people who are my age, 2014 was yesterday. But in reality, 2014 is 7 years old. Okay? And when she wrote this, she had no knowledge of a 2016 book of discipline. And that would have been helpful had she had that. So this is wonderful, but it too is dated. Now, if that were not enough, the latest discipline that you can get generally or have is the 2016 discipline. All right? You probably know, if you've been connected to our church for a while, that normally we have disciplines every 4 years as a result of the work that any general conference may have done. We have had a general conference of 2019. But we don't have a printed hard copy of a general conference result that was the Book of Discipline 2019. Now, there are addendums to this book as a result of 2019. So there was some legislation done at the 2019 General Conference, but it was a called session for a specific purpose. It was not a general conference session where all kinds of legislation were open for consideration. So keep that in mind. There are some few addendums to this book as a result of 2019, but not enough that would produce a discipline of 2019. So now normally, at this point, I mean, this is September 2021, I would be holding a discipline of 2020 because normally there would have been legislation happening at that discipline. Now, I don't need to belabor this, but all of you know, and those of you watching on video, COVID has turned the world upside down. And now we're hoping that we can be together in September of 2022 in a general conference. but I'm not making any kind of general worldwide announcement. But I just say to those of you locally here in Kentucky, there is even now conversation about, will we be able to have a 2022 General Conference? It's way too early for that conversation to be serious, but it is in the minds of people with the heartaches we're all feeling and the struggles we have as a result of what's been happening in the variations of COVID-19 that's happening both in the United States and around the world. But these are our resources material, and they're still helpful. And I'll be using this a good bit today. It's very helpful. It's still current. Now, let me remind you that this is not the work of the 2016 General Conference. All right? It's a representative of some of the work of the 2016 General Conference. But this represents the church since its founding in 1784. You hear that? This is the attempted knowledge and best thought and judgment of people over 200 years. Okay? We take the wisdom and try to build upon it. So this can be a very serious document because it has been built by a continual chain of United Methodist for over 200 years. It's the best wisdom that we know as a connection that we are. And it's helpful. Ed, next slide. Let's talk a little bit now, if we might, about what Beth Galbraith, I'm talking about, the connectional principle. What is the connectional principle? We are not, as I said earlier, just an organization. In fact, we are not an organization. Ed, next slide. We are a group of people who've come together in what Wesley called connection. And of course, in the English time of his life, the word connection is spelled differently. And you'll see that from time to time in different settings. Not C-O-N-N-E-C-T, but E-X-I-O-N. The connection. For Wesley, the connection was all of the pastors, all of those people serving congregations or bodies of believers coming together for accountability, for learning, and for discerning together. All right? So from the very beginning, the connection was a place, and we'll look at that next slide, Ed. The connection was designed to be a place where we reasoned together, we prayed and discerned together, we lovingly held one another accountable together. And those principles still apply, whether we spell the word connection differently or we realize that we're over 200 years beyond that period. Now, Frank quotes in his book the idea that the United Methodist Church is a connectional mission, not a single corporation. And he's getting at this to teach us about the legality of the church, which, by the way, has been so significantly important in the last 50 or so years particularly. The church is a living, he says, cultural tradition that endures because people are loyal to it not because it has a precise constitution. And then Frank references paragraph 139 of the discipline. But you can't turn to 139 because he's referencing the 2004 discipline. But if you have a discipline, the 2016, you can turn to paragraph 141. All right, and I'm going to do that so that you can see, because this is an important part of what we need to understand primarily. I'm getting to 141, and forgive me because it's a little slow, but in paragraph 141, which has become crucially important in the legal system of the United States, for example, particularly, though we're a worldwide congregation, a church. But as you can imagine, there have been a number of lawsuits against the church for many, many reasons. And some of them are tragic, such as child abuse, or I could go on and on. The point is that the legal system of the United States decided, sue anyone that may be connected and liable in any kind of given situation. But if you look at paragraph 141, I'm not going to read its entirety, but I want you to see, particularly down in the paragraph, that it says the United Methodist Church, in seeking fulfillment of this ministry, accordingly, it is appropriate that the meaning of the United Methodist Church, the general church, the entire church, and the church, as used in the Book of Discipline, should now be stated consistently with the traditional self-understanding of United Methodists as to the meaning of these words. And on down in the paragraph, the United Methodist Church as a denominational whole is not an entity, nor does it possess legal capacities and attributes. It does not and cannot hold title to property, nor does it have any official officers. Nor does it have any officer, agent, employee, office, or location. Conferences, councils, boards, agencies, local churches, and other units bearing the name United Methodist are, for the most part, legal entities capable of suing and being sued and possessing legal capacities. All right? Now, I think that's an important point for churches to understand. It's been a real struggle for many people to understand that there is no legal entity called the United Methodist Church, and it cannot hold title to property or anything else. Okay, next slide. I think it's really important for us to understand different points of the discipline. So then we have the feeling and the understanding of the connection. We're going to look at the geographical idea of the connection just a little bit down the pike, but not right now at this moment. That is, how is the connection, does it fit together? For example, local churches or districts or conferences or jurisdictions or the general church or central conferences and all of those sorts of entities that we'll be looking at a bit further. But I want to spend just a little bit of time getting the feel of the discipline itself. When I was, as I referred earlier, teaching polity and discipline in a seminary setting, I always wanted persons who were part of the class to understand. I don't think it's a requirement that you understand everything that's on every page of the discipline, nor do you have to memorize everything that's in the discipline. You're going to use certain sections of it more than you are others. For example, if you're looking at the slide, if you're a layperson in a local church, you're going to spend much more time in the 200s of the discipline. And I'm talking about paragraphs, of course, not page numbers, than you would if you were on the board of Ordained Ministry and you were looking in the 300s. And you're going to get much more comfortable with the area where you're feeling you need most understanding and clarity. But it is also, even if, for example, you're going to spend much more time in the 200s, if you would go back again and again to the 1 to 99 paragraphs in the discipline, if you please, that would be helpful. The 100s to the 199 would be really helpful. You don't have to remember every article of religion. We now have 2 sets of articles of religion in the discipline. One comes from the Methodist Church, and the other comes from the United Brethren Church. And in the Constitution, it was agreed upon that as we move forward as one, that we would recognize both articles of religion. So there are 2 sets there as a result of our merger in 1968, in the merger of the United Brethren Church and the Methodist Church. That, of course, as we know now, became known as the United Methodist Church. But if you look at the first series of paragraphs in the discipline, which if you have your discipline, turn it open and we can look in part together. We're not going to go over every single part, but you can see that the Constitution is the first part of the discipline. And it has a role to play that's significantly important for all United Methodists, if you please, to understand and affirm as we move along. After the brief history, then there begins the Constitution. And after the Constitution then, in 101 and beyond, we begin to get into the doctrine and doctrinal statements of the church. And if I were sharing in leadership for the video that may be used, I would be thinking that this is a great time to turn the video off for a moment and let people think together and look together out loud, where we feel some of what's taking place, and we begin to talk about the articles, for example, or what is it the Methodist Church thinks, for example, of sanctification, or what about the idea of the Lord's Supper? What do we think about baptism? What do we think about original sin or free will? Those are significantly important things. They're a part of the doctrine of the church. But my purpose today is to not try to teach individually each of those articles, but to help you understand that there's information there. That could be even helpful in a Sunday school class. You could, for instance, take a Sunday school class and they could go through a couple of articles a Sunday or something and not only read what's in the discipline, but then expand it. For instance, we're using Frank today and we're using Gilbert and others who have reflections on a certain part of our subject And that could be so as you're working in leadership roles. I have a coaching role presently with a group called SLI, Servant Leadership Incorporated. And it's a group of coaches that are attempting to help the church be more fully equipped to make disciples of Jesus Christ by the transformation of the world, in the transformation of the world through Christ. But part of the thinking of this organization is that every group, no matter the setting, would benefit from L to the third power. What I'm meaning by that, in case you're not acquainted with that particular movement, is every group should have a period of loving, learning, and leading. So that no matter who you are in your group, it could be a circle of United Methodist women, it could be a United Methodist men's meeting. I'm going to say, from my vantage point, it could be a finance committee meeting. It could certainly be an administrative council meeting. But the structure, the ethos, if you please, of the group was we always love, learn, and lead. That is to say, we always are focused at some point in this meeting on loving God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving one another as we love ourselves. And I could unfold that, but that works out in different ways. And sometimes it can be a devotional, but oftentimes it needs to be more than just a devotional. It needs to be a kind of experience where we're all involved. We don't have one mouth and everybody else are only ears, but that we're growing together into our likeness of Christ. And the learning period. So, what would be more appropriate than even some setting of time where we're learning some of the articles of religion, or we're learning something about some of the doctrine of the church. Those things could be very, very helpful, as well as inspiring to us. And it does also, for me, take away the idea that this could be a club instead of a tool. Because it's very clear that this has, if you please, the heart of God. That there are biblical foundations that are causing this to be. It's not a holy book now, I don't mean that, but it certainly is a significantly important book. And it carries some treasures that we have treasured for over 200 years. And that does indeed make it important. Now, I pointed out to you that the legal entity is paragraph 141 and not 139. There are many things that I could point out to you, but for example, let's go over to the 200s. That's where our lay people, but as well as clergy, will spend a good bit of their time. If you look at paragraph 201 and paragraph 202, you will find something that is significantly important. For example, the definition of a local church. What is the purpose of the local church? Wouldn't it be good just every now and then in various settings to read together or hear read out loud the purpose of the local church? This organization I referred to a little bit ago that I've been a part of in the coaching role really encourages covenants. Because when we look at it, covenants come from God. God was the first one to start covenants. And God's the one who believed covenants are important. And so in that setting, we encourage covenants in different groups. That literally, covenants are written down. And we can see with our eyes the covenant that we're in, what we've agreed to be and do together. That's extremely important. And a group that's meeting in this kind of setting I've been describing, every meeting are encouraged to look at the covenant. Not just every 6 months or year or 3 months, but every meeting take a few moments to look at the covenant. Are we still living in the bounds of the covenant? Are we still focused on where we really need to be? And this is not an exhaustive definition of what the church is and is doing, but it's a beginning good word about what it means to be the church in United Methodism and the function of the local church and how we're connected to the wider church and how we care about one another and how we define what we mean by a charge. That's extremely valuable and helpful for staying on target. So I'm trying to use illustrations of where the discipline can be a tool and how it can be helpful in being that tool. If you go over to paragraph 216 in the 16 discipline, you see the meaning of church membership and what it means to be a member of the local church. And in 217, it's expanded further into what it means. And so I'm pointing out the very beginning of the 200s, just to give you an idea of how this 200 section can be helpful. If you were to look, and I'm not going to spend much time here, but if you were to look, for example, at paragraph 228 about care of members, you may be surprised about some of the things that are printed there, and you maybe say, boy, do we have some growth areas to be focused on in our local congregation about caring for one another. And that's important, to care for one another. And this discipline gives us some direction on how we should be caring for one another. And then, of course, you get on over into the various roles of the women or of the men, or how we go about launching a new United Methodist Church, or whatever the case might be. The 300s are to do primarily with the ministry of the ordained. All right? And the ordained persons are set aside on behalf of laity to lead and help in the work of being the church. Elders are, for example, ordained to service and word, order of the church. Deacons are ordained to service and word, not to the order of the church. So the roles are a little bit different, but both are ordained persons. Local pastors are not ordained persons, but they are licensed persons to do work in a local situation that they have been assigned to do. And then we could go ahead and break down the role of laity in that leadership concept of how you can go through those various steps. And you all, as laypersons, have opportunities in different settings of the lay organization to understand those different positions or statuses that lay people can be in serving local congregations. And those are very, very significant roles. But let me help you understand something. None of us should like the phrase just laity. All right? There's no such thing as a person just being a layperson. All of us are equal in the body of Christ, every single one of us. And secondly, all of us are baptized to the ministry of the church. So it would be appropriate for any person to be called a minister in that sense. We're all equal. And when you are ordained, you are not exempted from your baptismal vows. And unfortunately, that may have accidentally fallen into the minds of too many people. I'm stuttering only because I'm thinking of a number of things I want to say, but I'm saying, I hope by the nudging the Holy Spirit, be careful what you're saying. But it's so important to understand that ordained ministry is not a level above something else. If you want to talk about levels, ordained ministry is a level below the normal level. Let me explain. Ordained ministry is called to servant ministry, biblically. Jesus said, "He who is greatest among you will be your servants." When they were in the upper room for the last meal, you'll remember that Jesus took the towel and the basin. He put the towel about himself and washed the feet of the disciples. And he said, you should do likewise. That's our role. That's what we should be, and be honored, profoundly honored, to try to be willing to do what the Lord gave us an example of doing. So I just say that because I don't want there to be tension between lay and clergy. And if we're not careful, that can develop. As I stand in the position of having watched from many different roles the church for a long time. And it breaks my heart sometimes to think of the pettiness of some of the things we've become involved in. And unfortunately, it weakens our witness to what the faith is really all about, and particularly to the observer who's only watching from a distance. So I maybe veered off a little bit there when I was looking with you at the ministry of the ordained, but it is significantly important. We did have in the life of the church, and still in the discipline, the role of the diaconal minister. And the diaconal minister actually existed as a role before the permanent deacon role. And I won't wander back into that information too much right now, but the diaconal role then is still a possible role for people who were consecrated as diaconal ministers. that role will fade away in time when we have no more diaconal ministers. I could, again, if I had time, open this up for dialogue and questioning, because there's a lot of good information that we could gain from one another simply in dialogue in this kind of time. I do just want to remind you that that the other role that is not an ordination but a consecration is the role of the Episcopal leader. When a person is elected a bishop, that person is consecrated to the work and life of a bishop. Not ordained to another order, but in our tradition of United Methodism, it's a consecration to another role in the life of the church. And I just say that in passing for some clearer understanding. Now, if you were to go to the 400s, for example, you get into what is generally titled the Superintendency. We could spend a world of time in the 400s, but it's mainly areas to do with superintending. It's the role of administration and the care for the church in that regard. If you go over to paragraph 425, for example, it has to do with appointment making. And it talks about the responsibility of appointment making and how clergy are involved and how laity are involved, and the importance of the broad perspective of appointment making. 426 deals with consultation on appointment making. Those two things are important always in the life of the church. We are Episcopal in nature of appointments. We do not have a called system. Now, what sometimes happens, mostly accidentally, is that we have a number of transfer persons into the life of the church. Now, I'm not talking about the last, let me just say, 3 to 4 years of the church. Up until the last 3 or 4 years of the church, it was a misnomer that was out there as what they now call fake news. And fake news is a real problem, isn't it, in the nation? I mean, I could give you quick examples and you could give me quick examples of fake news. And the problem is there are a lot of people who can't separate real news from fake news, and we have major divisions and stuff going on in America today as a result. And that is a bit of a picture of what, in a smaller way, has been happening in the life of the United Methodist Church for a number of years. Misinformation. Like, for example, misinformation is that the United Methodist Church in the U.S. is dying because everybody's transferring out to other denominations because we don't like what's going on in the church. Well, that's misinformation in this sense. Statistics do not reveal that. Statistics reveal that the reason the United Methodist Church is growing smaller than it was is because we are not taking in new professions of faith. That's the reason the church is getting smaller. It's statistically provable. We don't have people coming by profession of faith like we used to. Now, we used to be able to do it because the thing to do, I'm sorry I'm beginning to move around here a little bit, but the thing to do was go to church. everybody, if you please, for the most part, went to church before the 50s and 60s came into being and then beyond. And so, because everybody's going to church, everybody usually had families, and they were a little larger than the nuclear family of 2 children. And those children grew up learning about Jesus, about God and his love for them. And they went through classes and periods of confirmation training, and they came in by profession of faith. And the church was growing primarily in that way. And secondly, the church believed so strongly that Jesus is the way. He's the truth. He's the life. And so we want our people outside the church to know that and experience that. We want them to love God. And so we were not real backward about letting them know that. And it was amazing how Jesus was able to speak to them through us. And they came in as a part of the community of believers. And then the latter part of the 20th century, and now even the first part of the 21st century, that's changed. Things always change. Now we're moving into a post-Christian era within our own country. And it's not in vogue necessarily to go to church. In fact, if anything's in vogue, it's to talk negatively about those who do go to church. It's a different time. And so lots and lots of people are not feeling a need to be a part of a congregation. And somehow we're not surely as convinced as we once were that it's that important for other people to know the love of God and their significance in the sight of God, and that they can experience redemption. They can be forgiven of their sins. They don't have to live all their life with a guilty conscience. They don't have to struggle in trying to find peace and fulfillment that never, ever comes when that void they're trying to fill is a God void and not a material void or human, physical, or mental enjoyment of some kind. And so I don't want to be too negative in this area, but I started by saying it's a misnomer, it's misinformation to say the church is getting smaller because people are transferring out. In fact, up until this last 3 or 4 years, statistics will show that more people transfer into the United Methodist Church than transfer out of the United Methodist Church. And so why did I go down that route? Primarily because I was trying to illustrate a point about appointment making, to say that because a number of people come in to the United Methodist Church from other denominations, and they are wonderful people, and we're delighted that this is so, and they've become a part of the family of United Methodists, but they come with a prior history and understanding of how the polity and structure of the church really works. And they may have come out of, and often did, a congregational call system. And they get very frustrated with the idea that a bishop is going to tell them who's going to be their pastor. Now, if it were simply that, it would be unfortunate. But even though we have legal language in the discipline about appointment making, let me tell you something from experience. there is a lot of prayer that goes into appointment making. There's a lot of agony. There's a lot of conversation. It's oftentimes confidential conversation. There's a great deal of attempt to match the right leader with the right congregation. And I yearn for every congregation in Methodism, but more particularly Kentucky, to feel at peace and be focused on prayer as it relates to this whole issue of appointment making. Now, I do think that consultation helps us a great deal. Consultation here in September of 2021 has been somewhat of a major conversation because of the current situation in other places of the church geographically within the United States. But the discipline is very clear. Consultation is not notification. Consultation is not a call system, but it's something that's much better in my language and helpful as it's prayer-centered than either one of those other things might be. And so I simply point that out. I'm not teaching a course on consultation right now. I'm just simply trying to use an illustration that hopefully could be helpful to you in that. And again, if you're leading a session and using the video, this may be a wonderful stopping point and letting people dialogue around this somewhat and come to a greater understanding of how life ought to be in that situation. But I can say this to you. As a pastor in the United Methodist Church and in the Kentucky Conference, I have personally discovered that sometimes when I thought the bishop and the cabinet were off base and sending me to the wrong assignment, it turned out to be the very best thing that could have ever happened to me. And I found a congregation that was far, far more loving and beneficial and helpful than I could have ever been to them. And I think if we approach that as we're listening to Jesus and His direction on our lives and in our lives, we find that to be so. I know of congregations who felt like this is the wrong leader that you're sending to us, who've later said to me, "Thank you for sending this person. This has been one of the most godly, effective leaders I've ever known. And I could not have loved a person more deeply than I love this person." And then there are mismatches. And we have to be honest and real with one another that it happens. And the issue is not to ignore, if you're a bishop or a cabinet, that there are mismatches, and it's not to hide our head in the sand. If we are a congregation and we have a mismatch, and somehow we just bury our head in the sand, and if it sinks, it sinks. If it survives, it survives, and we wait it out. Neither of those should be the way. That's the extremes. But how do we handle this kind of situation? Well, it's very clear. We handle it with biblical principles. And in deep love and affection for one another, we deal with those issues. And I'm confident that the leaders in the Kentucky Conference in that area of appointment making will be the first to affirm a willingness to deal with any confusion about that in a very loving and biblical kind of way. So I think the discipline is helpful, and that's just one way that I point that out through the superintendency. Now, Ed, give us the other slide regarding the discipline's content there. So you see the 500s, the conferences, what that might be in regard to a general conference or a annual conference, central conferences. And then the 700s, of course, continue to be administrative order and the role of how a bishop handles this or that. The church property issues are in the 2500s and 2599. And that's where a local church leader might spend some time. And then the final section, of course, the 2600s and 2799, judicial administration. And I would point out, before we take a break here, I would point out that in 2702, let's take a look at it, for example. 2702 is chargeable offenses and the statute of limitations. So this is a paragraph that's extremely important, and unfortunately, we have to use from time to time. But if you want to know what is a chargeable offense, that is the paragraph that one looks at. Right now, I am preparing to be the presiding officer in a trial. In our church, we have, in 2700s, helps us to understand how it works. But unfortunately, there are occasions where we clergy, and we can also do it as lay people, violate our, in the place of clergy, our ordination vows and standards. And lay can do that in a local church. And these are things that happen, and a charge comes against us when that does occur. And when all else fails, we have what we say a trial that is a matter of last resort. We have no other options, all right? And so 2702 and beyond define not only the offenses, but how we deal with it when we can't deal with it any other way. And I was about to say, for instance, I'm preparing to do a trial in October by Zoom. We've never done that before. We don't know if we can do it well. Now, you can imagine I've been in consultation a great deal with attorneys and disciplinary experts. We can do it according to the discipline. It doesn't say we can't. But it's going to be most interesting, to say the least. Now, again, a wonderful place where a video could be stopped, and not just conversation, but prayer could be happening if we do worshipful work, because we could pray for situations that we may know about, or situations that we don't know about, but we don't need to know any of the details about it. We just need to know that there are human lives involved, and heartaches and heartbreaks and all are involved. And we want to put the love of God into the midst of all those kind of settings. There is fair process. As I say, it involves not only clergy, but laity. Rarely does it happen for laity, but laity can be charged. And you can find the details of that in the 2700s. Now, that is the broad view of the discipline. We're going to take a break, And after we have a little break, we'll come back and pick up from this point and move forward.